Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It is Friday, May 9th, another busy and eventful week. Yesterday, countries in Europe celebrated VE Day, the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. And of course, today, Russia celebrated Victory Day with a military parade designed to impress the world, including China's President Xi Jinping, who was there in person, of Russia's continued military prowess. Xi's in Moscow for 4 days, in part to cement his relationship with Russia and declare their joint opposition to the United States, something Washington's behaviors these past 3 months has made a bit easier. But how strong is this relationship really? Then also this week, an escalating war between two nuclear powers on the Indian subcontinent. New Delhi launched missile and airstrikes against Pakistan on Wednesday night in retaliation for the terrorist attack last month in Jammu and Kashmir that left 26 people dead. Pakistan is responding with strikes of its own, and while Washington is urging caution and an end to the escalation, the mood in both countries is, in fact, to do the opposite and continue to fight. So where will this end? Finally, a look at Gaza. On Sunday, the Israeli cabinet announced a qualitative change in its war against Hamas, calling up tens of thousands of reservists for a ground invasion and then occupation of major parts of the Strip. Gazans will be forced to relocate yet again to the south, and at the same time, a major humanitarian crisis is threatening the very survival of the people who remain there, with Israel having cut off all aid into the Strip for the past 2 months. A new Israeli-run aid distribution system is getting ready to restart humanitarian aid, but it is likely to be woefully inadequate for meeting the needs of the people there. So how should the world respond? Here to discuss these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Lee Hockstader is European commentator for the Washington Post. Anton La Guardia is diplomatic editor of The Economist. And Elise Labott is currently the Edward R. Murrow Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of Cosmopolitics, a Substack newsletter. Wonderful to see all of you. Good afternoon, Lee. Good morning, Elise, Anton. Lee, let's start with the big day. Huge military parade in front of the Kremlin with 20 world leaders, including the president of China, the head of the Communist Party of China, the many titles that Mr. Xi Jinping has, and of course, Vladimir Putin, basking in the victory that he seems to have decided was his alone in one form or another. So what is happening in the relationship between these two leaders, and how is it playing in Europe and around the world?
Yeah, remarkable day. It wasn't just the thousands of Russian troops and the missile launchers and the tanks and so forth, all the weaponry that they tried out for this annually. It was also that there was a whole regiment of Chinese soldiers who marched along with the Russians. So that was remarkable. These two guys, I might be off by a couple, but I think that they've met 43 times. This is a 4-day summit, as you mentioned. Today's the third day of it. Putin is 72 years old. Xi is 71. This is a moment at which I think they both see a unique juncture in their own generation and in the course of their lives, their political careers, to really put their stamp on the world. And of course, Trump has enabled that. They share interests in a multipolar world. They share a rival, an adversary, an enemy in the United States. And Trump, of course, has tried to, or he says he's tried to drive a wedge between the two. But in fact, the effect that he's had is probably the opposite. Through his trade war, he's alienated Xi, and now he's turning up the heat a little bit on Putin. But in any event, he's not going to get the peace deal he wants out of Putin. The Chinese-Russian relationship is close, but it's also fraught. For China, Russia is a source of cheap fossil fuels, but it's also sort of an albatross. The war in Ukraine. It's kind of driving a wedge between the Chinese and the Europeans. That doesn't help Xi. And for Russia, of course, they need China. China has kept that Russian economy afloat during this war. But Russia also, in becoming more and more dependent on China, has become sort of a vassal state because of the asymmetry of their size and economic power. So it's a complicated relationship, but there's also mutual dependency and overlapping interests.
At least complicated relationship, I think, is right. And there's a sort of an assumption among the commentariat that these guys are, two peas in a pot. But in some ways they are. They're both authoritarian leaders. They're both pretty much in control of their own societies. They seem to have an interest in stoking the United States. And yet, I think, as Lee rightly says, there are differences and different interests. The Chinese want something different from the world than the Russians may want. And so the question is, how do you see this relationship evolving? And is there a way to drive a wedge, which clearly was one of the hopes that the Trump administration, or at least some of the people in the Trump administration, brought into office?
Well, I'm sorry. Go on, Elise.
Yeah, so Elise. Was it Elise?
No, it's Elise. Elise. Yeah,
that's okay. We're similar, Elise in name. So I think you're right, but at the same time, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and I think that President Trump came in, wanted this great relationship with President Putin, both because he, has this kind of affinity or man crush on Vladimir Putin, whatever you want to call it, but definitely wanted this closer relationship with Putin, closer relationship with Russia, and thought maybe he'd, kind of do this reverse Nixon, right? Pull Russia away from China in terms of this kind of great power competition. But, Putin's actions in the war in Ukraine really don't seem to, make that able to happen. Trump has been trying to solve this deal. At first, we thought that, he was bowing to Putin, trying to give Putin everything he wanted in this deal with Ukraine. Putin couldn't even take yes for an answer. And so now you see Trump kind of say, hey, maybe he's playing me for a fool. Maybe, my bread is better buttered with Ukraine. And he solved this deal, made this minerals deal with Ukraine. Really, I thought it was very interesting statement when that deal came out, sending a message that the U.S. is firmly in Ukraine's future. So that's really not pulling Russia away from China. And I think at the same time, this summit takes place as both leaders are kind of looking at Trump's unpredictable policies. They're facing this bruising war. The tariffs have put China under immense economic pressure. And now China is boosting ties with other nations and portraying Beijing as a beacon of stability. So you would think that now Russia is going to bend more towards China. So I think Lee is entirely right that Russia needs China more, but Russia may need China more than they need the United States right now. So clearly this visit by Xi over there and that kind of deepen that no limits partnership, which we've seen does have limits, I think sends a message that it's not going to be so easy to pull Russia away from China.
I think that's right. And Anton, it strikes me, I think as Elise said, that of course Trump wanted to have a good relationship with Russia. He also wanted a big deal with China. And the way he has gone about both of them, on the one hand, with regard to the Ukraine issue that Elise mentioned, on the other hand, on the tariffs, where he said today that 80% tariffs would probably be a good low level to have, which is, 80% is basically the end of trade. In all practical purposes, he is alienating both of them in a way that is contrary to, I would argue, U.S. interest, but also to Donald Trump's interest.
Donald Trump thinks he's a great negotiator. The man who's has mastered the art of the deal, but he hasn't really struck any deals yet, except for a very narrow trade outline agreement with the Brits. So, the idea of bringing the war to an end in a day, well, we're well past 100 days. The great deal with China hasn't happened yet, although they're talking this weekend, so we need to sort of reserve judgment on that. And, and ending the war in Gaza is also, as we'll talk about later, also, vanishing away. So, at the same time, he is also upset important historical alliances with the Europeans and made Asian allies very nervous. So the kind of the some benefit of what he has done so far, I think, is on the negative side. On the specific U.S.-China relationship, I mean, the idea of a reverse Nixon was always for the birds. I think these guys are, in it for the long term. They keep saying they're in it for the long term, despite the differences and perspectives that they may have. They do have a fundamentally different outlook on the world. China wants an ordered world so that it can trade with it, ordered on its terms, so it wants change. But Russia really wants disruption and revolution to undo everything that's been done. It's not a particularly large trading nation apart from fossil fuels. So they have different long-term objectives, but step 1, 2, and 3 is to disrupt and dismantle American power, for which they so far have had a seemingly willing ally in Donald Trump.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. The U.S. is in some ways doing their bidding in a reverse America rather than a reverse Nixon. Elise?
Yeah, I think that's right. And clearly this summit and, this relationship is designed to weaken the U.S. on a world stage. I just want to ask Anton and also both of you, what do you think of this idea that maybe the three of them, this kind of sphere of influence carve up, the world in terms of, Putin on the Eastern European flank, China and Asia, and the U.S. kind of gravitating more towards North America. People have spoken about this kind of new Yalta. I don't really think it's feasible, but there's still, that talk always comes up. So I'm just wondering if that's, if anyone thinks that's possible.
Lee, how do you see that? And in some ways, the trade war kind of goes contrary to that, but there is this idea of the U.S. wanting to control the Western Hemisphere and being happy with sort of a sphere of influence policy.
And what they apparently have in common is this baseline belief in the legitimacy of seizing territory by force. I mean, Putin has proved that by his actions. Trump certainly gives voice to doing it all the time. Greenland and Panama and Canada and blah, 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 annexing other people's territory. And of course, Xi has ordered his military to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. And so, it's a kind of toxic brew of three major leaders, the three major leaders in some ways, who have no particular regard for international law and this rules-based international order. And so that's a sort of dangerous moment.
Yeah.
I'd also add, Ivo, in reply to Elise's question, that spheres of, Yalta happened, and then we had the Cold War. Spheres of influence tend to be not very stable because there's disagreements about where the borders end, and also there will inevitably be conflict over the perception that the other side is not abiding by the terms that they thought they had agreed on. And I think in the case of the U.S. and China in particular, the question of where America's perimeter should run is still highly contested. The one thing on which most schools of thought on foreign policy around Donald Trump seem to agree is the need for a kind of forceful policy on China. They don't agree whether the line should run down the first island chain, which is where the U.S. has most allies and there's greatest economic interest, or down the second island. So the first island chain runs from Japan through Taiwan, the Philippines, and so on. The second island chain runs through Guam, a series of islets in the Pacific, and it's a much thinner line to defend. And once you lose the first island chain, how far back do you have to go? So I think these are questions that are still open to debate. And interestingly, people like Pete Hegseth in the Pentagon, despite his many flaws and failings, does seem to be fairly conventional in his view, which is that we have to defend the prime purpose of the U.S. forces beyond defending the homeland is to prevent an invasion of Taiwan. So he's very much on the kind of, lean forward stance.
That's true, but I'm not sure that Trump really feels that way. Do you? I mean, I could easily see, if we're going to talk about Israel and the Houthi deal a little bit later, but I don't really think, allies and specifically Taiwan, the chips notwithstanding, I don't necessarily think that Trump has any allegiance to not letting, I'm not sure that this kind of historic idea that the U.S. would defend Taiwan would apply in the Trump administration. Do you?
He goes both ways depending on the day and the time of day. So you can find statements that suggest that he's a bit more interested in defending Taiwan. He certainly likes the Japanese. He likes Shinzo Abe. He likes the Indians. So he is sort of still playing with the idea of the Quad that would somehow contain China. But I agree with you. Should the invasion ever happen, would he send ships in to help out? Probably not. But does he leave enough doubt in Xi's mind that he thinks it's not really worth doing today? Is the question.
I think the other issue that keeps being forgotten is, where does South Korea fit into this? They're not part of the first island chain. They're the part of the mainland. We have 28,000 troops there. Trump's always talks about the fact that they shouldn't be there and they've been there too long. And importantly, Pete Hegseth, when he was in his first trip to Asia, skipped going to Korea, which perhaps we weren't noticing here, but let me tell you, the Koreans certainly noticed over there. It's a big issue. Also, Lee, it was VE Day tomorrow, and I think another remarkable speech was by the German President Steinmeier in the Bundestag, where he, a country that was defeated 80 years ago. That's what was being celebrated. Both reminded people that for Germans this was Liberation Day too, which is something he has said many times, but underscored that there was a huge breach with the United States on values. It was a quite extraordinary statement on the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II.
Yeah, he was expressing the shock of a lot of Germans and a lot of Europeans, for that matter, and also repeating what the new chancellor of Germany, who took office a couple of days ago, Friedrich Merz, has said himself. Merz said it the night he was elected a couple of months ago, that he was shocked at what the United States had become, and saw it as incumbent on him to help move Europe towards independence over time from the United States, which is an absolutely shocking thing for a German chancellor and now a German president to say.
Yeah, we live in shocking and interesting times. The question is, what will shock us next? And maybe that's a good move to our next topic, Anton. War between India and Pakistan has always been right at the top of one of the great scares of the last 50 or so years, because, of course, both are nuclear weapon states. And it looks like a conflict is not just brewing, it is escalating, and the traditional ways of de-escalation, which is particularly U.S. mediation, is limited to phone calls and statements in the Oval Office, as far as we can tell. So bring us up to date on where we are on the India-Pakistan confrontation, and how do you think this is going to play out?
Well, it's worth remembering that these two countries have gone to war 4 times since partition. So it's an extremely tense relationship. People in the West tend not to pay very much attention to it, even though the practitioners are aware of what the stakes are. And, this is repeating a familiar cycle of a terrorist attack in India, a retaliatory response, a retaliation to the retaliation, and so on and so forth. And you get this sort of tit-for-tat dynamic that can be very dangerous. Now, in the past, people have been able to avoid an all-out war, and one must fervently hope that it happens again. But things are changing fast. I mean, just to recap on what happened on this one, on April 22nd, there was a terrorist attack which killed 26 tourists in Kashmir, which is a disputed part of the border region between India and Pakistan. India blamed Pakistan. Pakistan denied involvement. India began to cut off water, interrupt water sharing agreements, close the border, and on May 7th carried out airstrikes against alleged terrorist targets, both in Pakistani-ruled Kashmir, but also in Pakistan itself and close to Lahore. The Pakistanis, meanwhile, claim to have shot down several Indian planes. India denies it. So there's a lot of sort of fog of war and fog of words going on here. And it is possible that that fog of words will allow each side to claim victory and honor and then be able to de-escalate, which is what happened the last time round in 2019. But, India, it is worth noting that Pakistan has reserved the right to respond to the airstrikes at a time of its choosing. So there may be more to come. And I think a number of things have changed. I mean, to begin with, the two sides are now well-established nuclear powers. The second thing is that India is rising economically and Pakistan is sinking. The difference in GDP between the two is now 10 times. In other words, 10 times. India's economy is 10 times larger than Pakistan's. We're seeing new military equipment come into play. So we've seen the first combat by the Chinese J-10 fighter against the French-made Rafales. So we're seeing a kind of reprise of the of sort of rival weapon systems being tested in battle by client states. And new technology is coming in. You've got drones being deployed and so on. So I think these things make things somewhat more unstable. And the last thing that's changed is the nonchalance of the Trump administration, which despite, some statements from the White House and so on, I think
it's a shame.
have sort of basically said, we don't care. It's none of our business.
Right.
J.D. Vance said,
This is an instance where there really should be some great power cooperation, right? Because the Chinese are the main patrons of the Pakistanis these days, the United States of the Indians. As for the
Russians,
diplomacy, I don't know, but American diplomacy right now, it's amateur hour. We've seen that in regards to Russia and Ukraine, and it's hard to believe that they're going to exercise effective diplomacy in de-escalating what's going on between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, President Trump, I think when asked about it, said, "Oh, it's a shame. They've been fighting for a lot of years. Someone knew something was going to happen." I not only do I not think you have the kind of desire on President Trump's part or his immediate national security team to do anything in terms of, again, it's none of our business, but really they don't have the kind of diplomats or staff in place that would really be able to put together. I don't think. Clearly they have people, civil service, but I don't think they have the people confirmed in place to be able to deal with it. I think back to some of what Anton was saying. Yes, I think it's different and it's escalated faster, I think, than any previous point since both states have become nuclear. And I think that they're different in a way, but they're also increasingly defined by democratic repression. This religious kind of fervor, fueling these old grievances that they had. And Modi's power has strengthened this kind of Hindu nationalist movement that, demonizes Muslims. The Pakistanis are demonizing the Hindus. I think even, this religious fervor. And I think, back to the U.S. part, look, the U.S. has always kind of treated Pakistan as a convenient ally when they needed them after 9/11, but really has never come to terms and made Pakistan come to terms with their extremist problem. And you see it coming back to bite them, with the Taliban, the TTP, even, in Baluchistan, some of these extremists are going against the government now. So really, because this started, as a Pakistani attack, I think the U.S. in terms of diplomacy really needs to come to terms with that terrorist problem, because now you can see this is, I think both sides are looking for an off-ramp, but two nuclear powers on the verge of escalation is not a good place to be.
No, I think all of that's right. Although we don't know whether it was a Pakistani attack. That's the Indian version. It was a terrorist attack, which were supposedly be supported by the Pakistanis.
Right.
But it does raise, it seems to me, Lee, this larger issue, which is, I think Elise and Anton are both right that technology, the leadership, the nationalism is fueling an escalatory spiral. I think you and all of you are right that the United States is neither interested nor probably capable. Steve Witkoff is a little busy these days to resolve this issue, and we this is the first signal, seems to me, that we're now entered a world in which the indispensable power is neither a power nor present. And so there is this question of who steps in the breach. Saudi and Iranian leaders are now both in Delhi to have negotiations. It's interesting that the Chinese, of course, they have no influence over the Indians. The Russians are busy celebrating, victory after victory. Who is going to step into this breach? Or are we just going to be in a world in which, when there are these conflicts, nobody is able to control them unless the people on the ground can do it so themselves?
You mentioned the name Steve Witkoff, and that's, it's an interesting to think back 30 years exactly to a guy named Richard Holbrooke, who was deployed by the United States, by the Clinton administration to resolve what at the time was the bloodiest conflict that had broken out in Europe in decades, which was the war in Bosnia. So here you had, a real diplomat, one of the most accomplished diplomats of his generation, one of the most accomplished diplomats of the late 20th century, and compare him, Richard Holbrooke, and that prowess with Steve Witkoff, who is a property guy. He used to own apartment buildings and be a lawyer for developers in New York with no known diplomatic experience or expertise or knowledge of the landscape. So, this is the source of this vacuum that we're seeing, this complete disdain for expertise in many, many realms that you're seeing from the Trump administration, from science to education and so forth and so on, but also for real professional diplomacy. And that leaves this vacuum of American power.
But Anton, there are others who could do diplomacy. I mean, the Brits have been doing it for about 300 years. They actually have a little expertise in history in this part of the world. Is this the time for Mr. Lamy to go to Delhi and Islamabad, or to do that together with the French foreign minister and maybe the EU High Representative Kaja Kallas, or nobody's going to be listening to them?
I think, if you ask me, having the Brits trying to mediate this would be disastrous, given that sort of British partition, the partition of British India is the kind of original cause of the trouble. I mean, they can play a role as part of the Europeans. I suspect the people who have a voice with both sides would be people like the Saudis or the Gulf states, and we're going to talk about Gaza in a minute. But the role. The increasingly important diplomatic role of Gulf states, I think, is one of the interesting dimensions of this age. As far as sort of the lack of professionalism among the Americans. I mean, first of all, the National Security Council is thin and getting thinner since Mike Waltz's departure. Second of all, there's very few appointees, and Donald Trump himself has, I think, struggles to understand that people have that people have politics and history and nationalism too. That it's not just we want to live in a nicer house, or we want everything depends on sort of economics and what can I get out of this. And I just find that this administration is particularly badly poised to deal with it. And just one more thing. I mean, Trump came in saying, I want to be the peacemaker of the world. He was, hankering for a peace prize, said, war is terrible, all these people are dying. But both in Gaza and now in India and Pakistan, he doesn't seem to be terribly concerned with the people who are dying or the prospect of worse conflict. The one he just seems to care about and is fixated on is people dying in Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah, and even on that, you could argue that he's not really deploying all the leverage of American power. Or the wisdom of diplomacy to get that done. Elise?
Yeah, and I think it's exactly the idea that he's putting Steve Witkoff, this real estate deal maker, in terms of putting him as the special envoy, as his kind of consigliere, if you will, on all of these issues, shows that he does see Gaza or the Mideast peace. The Mideast conflict and he has said, as a real estate problem to solve. Kashmir is in the middle of India and Pakistan. Ukraine is about territory. So this is all about kind of territory, about real estate. And to Anton's point, doesn't understand that these, decades-long conflicts come from religion, tradition, culture, nationalism, history. That's of no, he doesn't understand it and really doesn't care about it. And so, I think we're in this period over the next 4 years where these conflicts, while President Trump does want this peace process and might try to solve them, maybe getting the sides talking is okay, but I don't really see the U.S. kind of diving in and dealing with these core issues of any of these conflicts, Gaza being the next one we're going to talk about.
Yeah, I think let's switch to Gaza because in some ways, one way to interpret what has happened this week is the beginnings of the implementation of the Trump peace plan for Gaza, where apparently because Steve Witkoff was in Gaza, saw that the entire place has been literally destroyed as a result of 19 months of extraordinary violence and war. The solution was to just move everybody out and rebuild it as a Riviera on the on the Mediterranean. And at least the new policy announced by the Israeli cabinet seems to be designed to for Israel to take as much control, if not total control, of the entire territory, leaving the Palestinians with no place to go.
Well, this was always the plan, right? To reoccupy Gaza and hold it indefinitely. But now the Security Cabinet last week or Sunday approved a deal. If no hostage and ceasefire deal is reached by May 15th, coinciding with President Trump's visit this week, which is obviously since there's no progress towards a deal at all. Basically, they're going to flatten the area, flatten all remaining buildings, displacing, virtually the entire population of 2 million Palestinians to a single humanitarian area in the south, trying to push them out. And now these new operations have killed about, 50, in total, they've killed about 50,000 Palestinians. That's according, obviously, to the health ministry in Gaza, run by Hamas. But, the numbers, even if it's half of it, it's still a lot. Negotiations over the ceasefire deal are complete standstill. And Prime Minister Netanyahu has pretty much said that he's willing to forgo those last American hostages in order to completely destroy Hamas. But if you look at some of the polls, Israelis, I would say, a large majority of Israelis don't think that they'll be able to get rid of Hamas unless there is a deal on the hostages. But meanwhile, new operations, expanding military operations, very unpopular. They've called up 70,000 reservists, and about 70% of Israelis oppose this reoccupation. Airstrikes are continuing, and the humanitarian situation once again is awful. Not that it got good, but it was getting a little bit better. Dire shortage of food, water, medicine. From this blockade that started in March. And the UN once again is warning of a growing humanitarian catastrophe.
Anton, I think Elise exactly rightly sort of paints the picture. And yet, neither the administration nor anybody else seems to particularly care. Whereas we are dealing with the lives of 2 million people who have no place to live, who have no food, no water, no sanitation, no healthcare, and who are stuck because none of their neighbors want them, and they have no place to go. And yet, a war in that circumstances, the continuation of the war is deeply unpopular, as at least rightly says, in Israel itself. And yet, it's happening, and there is no, the Europeans are saying this is terrible. The UN is saying this is terrible, but in the meantime, it's happening.
It is one of the great tragedies and horrors. It is muted. I think the response is muted partly because a lot of Americans, in particular, saw the appalling acts of violence of October 7th as a kind of replay of September 11th. And they said, well, we responded militarily. The Israelis have a right to do so too. And the thing about terrorism is that you never really defeat it entirely. and therefore there's always a reason to keep going on and going on and on. And Netanyahu is I think being dragged to the right by his coalition and his own desire to stay in power and to stay out of trouble with his criminal cases. So is sort of yielding to that extreme faction in Israeli politics. It basically says we will reoccupy Gaza as a preliminary step to depopulating it and recovering the land for ourselves. He doesn't say that, but his actions kind of nudge him in that direction. He's corralling the population in the southern corner of Gaza, and no doubt hopes that they will be pushed across the border into Egypt or taken away and brought elsewhere. The Americans, I think, enable this to some extent with the idea of a Riviera. Now, there's not going to be a kind of international Riviera in Gaza, but the fact that Donald Trump spoke in those terms and made population transfer acceptable, I think, has encouraged Netanyahu. I mean, he was, when he was in the States, he was plainly thrilled by that, even though, interestingly, he's at odds with Donald Trump on the talks with Iran and was not told that a ceasefire with the Houthis was about to be implemented. So he's being blindsided by Donald Trump. But on this question of Gaza, he pretty much has carte blanche.
You can also see that. You can also see that from the U.S. Congress. 535 members of the U.S. Congress, and I think only 90 have expressed any sort of reservations about level of casualties, humanitarian disaster, the prospect of mass starvation. 90 of 535 members of Congress. In other words, there are really no guardrails coming from Washington in terms of Netanyahu's leeway and the Israeli military's leeway to inflict more carnage in Gaza. And, the world should ask itself, well, how much is too much? With full recognition that October 7th was an atrocity. And yet, how much is too much in terms of reprisal, revenge, and effort to wipe out Hamas, which is not going to be wiped out, clearly, at this point. It's been 19 months. There's compassion fatigue. That's part of it. But you just wonder if it can go on indefinitely.
Yeah, I think that is the question, and somehow the fear is that it probably can. Elise, Anton rightly mentioned the Houthi deal. I mean, in some ways, I think the way that Anton framed the issue of Iran, of the Houthis, and Gaza is interesting. On Gaza, it's carte blanche in some ways. But on the question of Iran and the question of the deal with the Houthis, which was a ceasefire of the Houthis firing on U.S. ships, but not on Israel. Indeed, a missile exploded next to Ben Gurion Airport just on Sunday, caught the Israelis off guard, if not flat-footed. And now, in many ways, leaves Israel having to deal with the Houthis without the United States, when the United States have declared victory on a strategy that has still not been explained. So, what is happening on the Houthi front, and how did the Israeli and the U.S. Look at this issue, particularly as Donald Trump is going to the Gulf next week, an issue that I'm sure we'll talk about in our next show on the 16th of May.
Yeah, he announced this deal just days before he was headed to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. These are nations that are directly threatened, at least UAE and Saudi, by Houthi forces. Look, the U.S. has been going after the Houthis for the past year or so, in the last month, very intensively. Trump looked at the numbers and said, we think we're doing Israel and the Gulf and the Europeans a favor by keeping the dealing with this as a freedom of navigation issue. And we're not getting our bang for the buck. They made a deal with the Houthis. You stop shooting at us, we'll stop shooting from you at you. And what about Israel? And who's the Houthis hit the Ben Gurion airport a few times over the last week. UAE and Saudi, who have been on the receiving end of devastating strikes by the Houthis. You're on your own. And Mike Huckabee, U.S. ambassador to Israel, was just asked, well, what about Israel? And he said, well, look, we don't need permission to make a deal with the Houthis. And, we'll respond if the Houthis hit Israel and American citizens are hurt, then we'll respond. But, this deal excludes any protections for anybody else but the United States. And this is textbook. It couldn't more nakedly embody President Trump's America First foreign policy. This is just naked U.S. ambition, like it or hate it. He wants the Houthis to stop shooting against the U.S., and he got it.
So it's kind of interesting because, of course, we had an extraordinarily insight, Anton, into the beginnings of these strikes because thanks to Jeff Goldberg being included into a Signal chat and saw the debate with inside the administration on this. And what always struck me about that chat is it wasn't really clear why we were getting involved into a major shooting war with the Houthis, by the way, at a cost that is now well over $2 billion to the United States and a significant negative impact on American preparedness to deal with the conflicts elsewhere, including in East Asia, since we redeployed a whole bunch of stuff from East Asia to this area. And we just declared victory and went home. Is that how the administration is going to deal with the realities of a complicated world?
I think part of it was to show Iran that the Americans were willing to resort to force. They were looking for leverage over Iran, and probably had little to do with the Red Sea or Israel. That's my sense of it. I mean, but again, the Signal Gate chat shows us the end of the conversation rather than the beginning of it. So we don't really know what the origins were, but I suspect that it has to do with it happened at the same time as they were sending B-21s to Diego Garcia, and they were piling up aircraft carriers in the Middle East to the horror of Sam Paparo, the Indo-PACOM commander, and now that negotiations seem to be making progress, at least in the words of Steve Witkoff, then maybe he doesn't feel he needs to be rattling the saber quite so hard.
So, I mean, Lee, is this was a brilliant move to get the Iranians to cry uncle? Is that how you see it?
I'm not sure the Iranians are going to be crying uncle, but it's obviously the latest setback that they've faced. I'd put it that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, my view has always been that if they can get an Iran deal, then which I think may be closer than people realize. It worked. It's unfortunate that the deal is likely to be the same one as the one that Trump walked away from in 2018. But that's a whole other different story. Elise, when I think you're right, America First. This is what this deal looks like. But if you are an Israeli or you're a Saudi or you're Qatari or from the UAE or indeed Japanese or German, what do you take away from this?
I take away from, if we can do something for President Trump, he'll, be our ally. It's a very transactional world that we're living in now, and the rest of the world is going to be encouraged to follow suit. And, that indispensable American power, at least for now, is, not available to us unless we can do something for them. I think, Prime Minister Steimer of the UK has been playing it pretty well, trying to show that, the UK can deliver for the US and the US is trying to follow suit. And so, look, I think it's going to be a supremely uncomfortable visit for President Trump when he goes to Saudi and the UAE next week. Qatar has a good relationship with the Iranians, so I don't really think it'll be that uncomfortable there. Will they give him a frosty reception? Or will they try to double down and give investment in the United States as he's looking for to show they could be useful and that transactional relationship will work? We'll have to see. I know that I spoke to diplomats in the region over the last couple of days and they were shocked. And so I think they're kind of still reeling from this and have to decide how they're going to play it.
Well, we will be watching it closely here and come back next week with another discussion of what happened in the Gulf, whether they were shocked or going to send another hundreds of billions of more deals to the United States. I know what President Trump is going to say, but what is the rest of the world going to be doing? That is what we'll be looking at. I can't think of three people that have looked at our issues today that are better suited for that than Lee Hockstader of the Washington Post, Elise Labott now of CFR, and writes a fantastic Substack called Cosmopolitics, and Anton La Guardia of The Economist. Thanks to all three of you, and thanks for all of you tuning in and listening. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.